Hello, welcome to the 8th episode of Peter York's Culture Wars House Party. I'm Peter York and my podcast is about culture wars, the way modern politics is so often played out with symbols and scapegoats, with lying and astroturf organisations instead of the real things and the big debates. I'll be talking to the players and commentators in these culture wars and getting them to explain what they think is really happening. We'll have some fun and we'll have some gossip and we'll ask some really vital questions like who makes the best suede loafers in Jermyn Street. Now, my guest today is Dylan Jones and he's a serial stylist, serial editor of smart big city magazines and newspapers. From Arena, the first 1980s new generation men's magazines, to GQ, Gentleman's Quarterly, a long-standing Condé Nast title that he edited from Vogue House in Hanover Square, no longer, Vogue House that is, from 1999 to 2021, and then editor of the London Evening Standard for 2 years, and he is now its editor-at-large. He's also written or edited 28 books about people, interesting people, from Bowie to Terry O'Neill to Jim Morrison to Paul Smith, and about fascinating worlds like the early 1980s new romantic clubland and musicland, the world of particularly Spandau Ballet, Steve Strange, Boy George. His autobiography, These Foolish Things, was published last year, and it's an absolutely compelling account of how a totally style-obsessed boy with a stammer, induced by a brutal father who beat him daily, totally took control and became a kind of publisher impresario and a very confident public speaker. He's an editorial impresario, particularly as an organiser over the decades of that GQ Men of the Year event, the biggest do of its kind in the country. Now, if you were lucky enough to go, you saw a jaw-dropping range of absolutely global A-list famous people. Not just celebrities like pop stars and film stars, but politicians too, all gathered in London. How did he do it? Maybe he can explain. There's a group of admiring old codgers who've known Dylan from his St Martin's graduate days and remember how he went everywhere in that early 80s up-all-night world, and how he developed into London's greatest host. Welcome, Dylan. I think it's fair to say you were an avid fan as a wee boy of people like Bowie and Ferry and the writer Tom Wolfe, all people with an acute, educated visual sense. And when you moved to London from High Wycombe, you went to art school, St Martin's, of course. You were then an up-all-night person, going to all those new places in London's very late 70s, early 80s clubland, soaking it all up, but not quite sure what to do with it, where you wanted to go. But you were meeting people, you were meeting everyone. It's the most extraordinary record of people I think I knew, but have forgotten, people I read about, but have forgotten. But you met them all then, the punk survivors, the Blitz kids, and a range of serious art school contemporaries who succeeded as fine artists later. How did you become a magazine editor, a words person, rather than a designer or stylist?
Hello, Peter.
Hello.
Very, very simply, when I left St Martin's, I went to Chelsea. I did foundation course at Chelsea, and then I did 3 years at St Martin's doing graphics, specialising in photography, not realising that I wasn't a very good photographer. But as soon as I entered the real world, not only did I discover that I wasn't a very good photographer, but my heart really wasn't in it. I didn't feel it. I wasn't feeling it. And I suppose in a fairly dissolute way, I immersed myself, not consciously, but I immersed myself in clubland because it was a way of putting those big decisions at bay, I suppose. And I would prefer to do silly jobs, inconsequential jobs, rather than apply myself to a career which I may not have been successful in. And I wasn't really sure, like you say, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. So I was lucky. Wherever I've worked, I've always gone out of my way to have work experience people, young people from school or from college, to come in and work, because I think it's a fantastic opportunity. As a quick digression, I think the problem is these days that, most recently at the Standard, they tend to be kind of offspring of friends. So you have all these wonderful people doing work experience, but they're all the same people. They're all exactly the same people. They're all very charming. They're all privately educated, but they all think exactly the same way. Yeah. And so the pipeline is a real problem. When I was at GQ, the mayor's office were very helpful. However, we had a lot of people. Every week there would be a work experience person from somewhere. And some of them, they're quite young, some of them would be brave enough to come and have a chat under the sort of the auspices of asking advice. And I don't think they really wanted advice. I think they just wanted to be in the room.
Yes.
So we had a chat, and I always gave the same 2 pieces of advice. I say that when you have an opportunity like this, particularly at your age, you should just work like stink, because this is the place where you can get on. And I would always say, we're not looking for people with great ideas, because we've got lots of ideas. Ideas are easy. What we're looking for is people who can make something happen, whether it's delivering a package or getting someone on the phone or just doing something. We give you a project and you do it. In fact, there was one guy who was borderline irritating who volunteered for everything. And in the end, obviously, he'd been there 6 months. We just said, will you give it to so-and-so? And so-and-so became indispensable. But my point is, the second thing is that we can teach you the first thing, but the second thing is you need to be lucky. And we can't teach you to be lucky. And I was incredibly lucky because I had a fairly dissolute life, a rather kind of quite big cheese in a very, very, very small world. And I was getting up in the middle of the afternoon, having one meal, watching Channel 4, and then going to a nightclub. And that was kind of my very small life. And parts of me thought that was quite grand. I knew it would have to come to an end. But a photographer I knew from St. Martin's called Mark Bailey, who I think was at LCC now. He was taking some photographs for an independent style magazine called ID. And he needed someone to interview the people he was photographing. And as I had nothing to do the next day but get up late, eat, watch Channel 4 and then go to a nightclub, I said I'd help him. So I went to this shoot, which was I think it was in Holborn Studios. And I interviewed these people. And I'm sure my questions were sort of as sophisticated as, where did you buy your socks and how much do you hate Margaret Thatcher? However,
stuff.
I typed all this stuff up on my little red Remington typewriter, which my father had given me years beforehand. And I sent it in, I posted it in one of those long envelopes, folded up pieces of A4 paper, took a stamp on it and kind of didn't really think any more of it. And then about 2 weeks later, someone said they'd had a call from a person at this magazine and could I call them? And I did, and that was it. Terry Jones, who was the editor and founder of the magazine, became a very good friend of mine, still a very good friend of mine. I'm seeing on Sunday. He offered me a job and I grabbed it, and that was it.
Yeah. But when did the iron and the steel enter you? Because you're now a very, very disciplined person, I would say, quite a steely person. But in describing the young you, you're anything but.
Actually, I realized immediately that I was incredibly disciplined. That's a good word. Literally, the first day I walked into the office, it was chaotic and it was mad and it was kind of silly in many respects. And it was glamorous, and the kind of the adjacency to interesting people was the point of it. But I realized quite quickly that I was incredibly disciplined, and I think you can interpret that in many ways. But I think, again, it's about control. And I suddenly realized that I could control this because I wanted to do things in a very orthodox way. Even though I had no experience, literally no experience, and couldn't actually write very well, because I'd never really done it, hadn't read very much, I knew that I could apply myself. And so I did. And I think my sort of conservatism with a small c and discipline helped enormously with this kind of barrage of madness, which I was lucky enough to fall into.
Your conservatism with a small c, what does that mean?
Quite traditional, I suppose. And I knew when I was that age that I knew that I wasn't going to end up as a kind of dissolute person. I don't know how I did, but there was something there already. I think that something I had in me was incredibly a sense of self-preservation. I think arrogance. I think it probably was displayed as arrogance at the time, but I think it was an inner kind of determination. I think to keep my head above water.
But it was more than that, wasn't it? Because, and you've written about it, the fact that you found yourself in a sort of, whatever we might call it, a left-leaning world, and you were the only small c and big C conservative person in it.
At that age, I don't think I was. And in some respects, I don't think I am now. In many respects, I am. But that wasn't part of the template at all. It didn't really occur to me. In fact, culturally, which is what I was primarily obsessed with, or even just casually, the things that interested me were cultural. And
yes,
almost all culture, interesting culture, is left-leaning.
Yes. How do you feel about that when you talk about it in, let's say, art schools or Cardiff University? The idea that culturally interesting things are left-leaning, and then what happens? Because as Steve Bannon, that well-known cultural intellectual Steve Bannon, has said, culture is upstream of politics. In other words, that politics will develop out of the culture, which comes out of cultural influences, which you say, I think rightly, certainly it's recently, have come out of left-leaning people.
I think that we all know, and you've written about it, and you've been very prescriptive about it, and you've probably immersed yourself in this world in ways you perhaps haven't before, if I can be so bold. But I do think...
No, you're completely right.
I think that we all know that that awful phrase, culture wars, has become a very emotive environment recently. And the kind of strident nature of it from all sides has made things far more complex, far more divisive. And it has caused enormous problems, I think. But we will come through that, I'm sure.
But what does culture wars mean to you in the development of your feelings about the world and the development of the way you relate to the world? Because you're an influential person. And so you're inevitably a player in those culture wars. What's your team?
I don't have a team. I have very strong views about particular subjects. Most people do. But I've always tried to stay slightly removed. I've gone in hard when I wanted to, or when I found something interesting. But I think that going back to everything that I've been involved with, I've always had kind of one foot in and one foot out. Even back in the kind of pop culture days and the youth culture days of late teens, early 20s, I was always slightly reserved. I was always slightly on the edges. Fundamentally, I'm not a great joiner of anything, and I don't really like reunions or revivals or things like that. And I suppose, actually, becoming a journalist, that kind of made complete sense, because it's a mixture, I suppose, where I've sort of operated is in that slim piece of land between objectivity and subjectivity, which I think lots of people do, and that's a very fertile place to be, I think.
But you employed and commissioned people who were wildly about one side or the other, who were in the facts business or the feelings business.
18 months ago, after October the 7th and the Palestinian attacks, I was adamant that I wanted to reflect as many feelings as possible. And I've never had a problem. In fact, I've advocated it, having very strong emotions expressing completely opposite points of view on the same page. I think that's very, very healthy, particularly at the moment, because most media organizations don't do that, and they go out of their way to do exactly the opposite. And even though I went out of my way personally and professionally to support the Jewish community in London, I made sure that as many people had their voice as possible. And there were lots of people on the paper who had very strong opinions, still do. And I've never had a problem with publishing something that I don't agree with. I think it's not about me, it's curation.
My first reaction, or second reaction, as things developed in Gaza, was to say, on the face of it, I don't have skin in the game, being neither Jewish nor Muslim, but I do come from North London. And it's a very important observation. If you come from inner North London, NW3, all these things are very real to you because you will know at school, in life, as neighbours, and later as colleagues, Jewish people, in the way that, and you were talking about the Jewish community in London, in the way that you only had to be a home counties person, like my home counties cousins, and you almost would never have met anybody Jewish. That's an extraordinary difference, because it's a very small community, and for the most part, it's a very big city, concentrated community. So, and that, I think, changes people's assumptions about the world, whether they live in that kind of big London, big Manchester, whatever community, or whether they live out there in the inner bits of Hampshire or something like that.
What's your point? Sorry.
My point is that how I felt, and then in future how I might respond to that, was shaped by the fact that I had experience of that community and other people didn't, and relating to those other people's, as a commentariat. You remember that great expression, as a commentariat member, I had to remember that constantly. And I think what you're saying about having very different views on the same page is important. But you're dealing with communities with very different understandings of the world because of their own experience.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And obviously I was lobbied very hard by a wide variety of people, and some of which I listened to and a lot of which I kept at bay. But I think that the important thing was to find a way through it all. And also, it's not my newspaper, it's a newspaper that represents people in London. And as we both know, London is an extraordinarily diverse place in many, many different ways. And at conference, early morning conference, which is very, very early because obviously we're notionally an evening paper rather than a morning paper, so you have the news in a different kind of cycle. The most interesting or the most complex parts of that conference was comment, and actually the cartoon.
Yep.
Because it would be in 3 blocks. You'd have news and sport and the kind of headlines. And that would be 15, 20 minutes. And then there would be culture and lifestyle and et cetera, et cetera. And then towards the end, it would be the leaders and the comment pages and the cartoon. We had brilliant cartoonists who would sit on the edge of conference. So it's a huge room with lots of people in it. And then our cartoonist would sit with the door open, with a chair just outside. And I got to be quite fascinated with how long it took him to go. Because it was a deadline. He had to go and draw a cartoon in time for our publication. He didn't have the luxury of 6 hours or 12 hours. It had to be done in about an hour and 3/4. And I was slightly worried when he was still there after about 7 or 8 minutes, because he realised that the 2 great issues of the day that he had to clash together weren't there for him. But the discussions of the leaders and the arrangement of the comment pages, some of which had already been commissioned and some that you would commission there and then, or the comment editor would. Those were the most enjoyable parts of the entire operation because you were actually making news as opposed to just recording it.
Well, I've just been, in a sense, reunited with cartoonists, or one particular cartoonist, Martin Rosen, having my latest book embellished, hugely improved by his marvellous cartoons. And I've got over there is his cartoon of Liz Truss looking like a mad child, and it's very, very funny. It added immeasurably to it.
She doesn't look like a mad child. She is a mad child.
Yes, that is true. But I'll send it to you. It's very, very funny. Now, when you think of that culture which you sort of inherited as art school product in London, you inherited it in part from a rather earlier groups, the ones I described as the thems, and you got to know them inevitably. And then there was your own milieu here, your contemporaries in the creative industries. And then you think of the passage of time, and you see it's a different world now. How do you think those people that you met either as their junior or your contemporaries then, are reacting to the utterly different mood? What's the mood in those art schools and those media platforms now?
Are you talking about my contemporaries or people in those environments now?
A bit of each, but particularly about your contemporaries. It's been a very strange ride.
I don't think it's any great surprise that people change.
Yeah.
They become angrier or they become less angry.
Yeah.
They move politically. They become strident. They kind of disappear. They take less interest instead of more interest. And I think it's a very interesting question. However, I think that you won't be surprised that all of these people that you've known, that I've known, they all develop in very different ways and they all have very particular views and they're not binary and they don't think one thing or the other. They might have a particular take on a particular subject or a piece of legislation or something, but the amount of emotion that they put into that or the amount of intellectual consideration, it might be 95%, it might be 5%. So I don't think you can be kind of blanket like that. I think it is interesting in a very kind of fleeting way to look at how people represent themselves on Instagram and social media, particularly visual media like TikTok and Instagram, where it isn't driven by the angry word. I think that's interesting. But a lot of people just step back.
Yes.
And particularly a lot of people in the entertainment industry, because I think that particularly more experienced people or people who've been around for a while, if you are in the entertainment industry, and the entertainment industry is much broader now than it was 30, 40 years ago, that things can come back and bite you on the backside. So
yes.
People are careful.
Yes. People are being careful, and people are also withdrawing and saying, I don't do that stuff now. I'm just a painter. I'm not a talker. I'm not involved in those things. Count me out, etc. And that sometimes is in parallel to moving out of the centre and going somewhere comfortable and nice and just keeping a tiny little flat in London. But there's a definite tone called count me out, I
do think that's true. And I think that, I've always said this, I'm not the great one for saying my pop music is better than your pop music. You always have to embrace the young. You're an idiot not to. And,
yes.
and I like to think that whatever is happening in our city, that there are groups of young people in dark corners in inhospitable parts of the postcode breaking things, which is what they're meant to do.
Yes.
And I used to get quite, not angry, but if we were discussing something on the paper about a particular subject and someone was dismissive of a particular idea or something that had been floated that day or a demonstration or something, so you might think that and I might think that. And we might be right. But there's an office out there full of very young people who are going to violently disagree with you. And when I say violently, I probably do mean violently. And we need to embrace them and find out what they mean and why they mean it.
Well, you were talking earlier about culture wars and culture wars being enormously divisive and therefore quite painful. What are the particular culture wars that have struck you in that way? What are the particular culture wars where you can't completely hold yourself aloof?
I don't think you should be aloof. I think you need to be engaged. But like I say, you need to make sure that you are a multi-attitudinal platform. And just to repeat, I have my views and I have had my views, and often I will use them, particularly if you're a newspaper columnist, you have to. But like I say, it's very important to not get caught in the way that so many people not only accidentally get caught now, but kind of choose to. I think it's very dangerous. I don't think this is... I'm not saying anything new. I think that...
How do you mean?
Well, there was a point a couple of years ago where I thought that the pendulum might be swinging back.
From?
To the kind of strident anger on both sides of pick your topic. But I don't think it has, and I don't think it's been helped by the American election. And there's a lot of nervousness around at the moment. Economically, things are not great, and everyone's feeling very, very tentative, I think, which doesn't help in these instances.
Now, you further said, I would suggest, earlier today, you said, when I talked about the C's, the big C and the small c, you said that wasn't relevant then. You hadn't got there then. You'd found the iron in your soul, meaning the ability to be a very disciplined worker when some of the people around you weren't very disciplined workers. But you hadn't got to the point of being a big C person. But then you most obviously did. You talked about it. Your friendship with David Cameron, all those things made you a big C conservative person, but in a different time. How do you feel about all that now?
It was fascinating. I certainly don't have any ill feeling towards it. It was a fascinating part of our political history. My initial interest was professional because I didn't see why politics was being ignored so much. And even though I have huge respect for Tony Blair, more now so than ever, actually, I did feel that we were in danger in the worlds that we were moving in of being far too kind of accepting, I suppose. And also, I wanted to shake things up a bit. I mean, I was very expedient, which is why I hired people like Alastair Campbell and Piers Morgan, because I wanted to talk about politics in a different way and make it interesting. And I very quickly realized that politicians love attention. They absolutely love attention. And also, they, unlike everyone else in the entertainment industry, they go out of their way to pretend that they're very guarded, but actually they're the opposite, which is driven by that kind of almost lust for attention. And I think we had a lot of fun. And it became, particularly with Piers, Piers wasn't very good with women, but he was very, very good with men. It became a kind of gladiatorial arena. And I remember once walking through the office, and there was a press release on one of the features editor's desks. It was a press release for a children's book that Alan Rusbridger had written, who at that time was the very famous editor of The Guardian, very successful editor. And we had been trying to put Piers Morgan together with Alan Rusbridger for months and months and months, and we kept getting no's.
That would have been fun.
Well, it was, and it happened. And and I said to, it was Stuart McGurk, who was a brilliant journalist who now works, I think, largely for The Guardian. I said, let's do this. Let's respond. Let's say that GQ, Britain's finest men's magazine, would love to do something on Alan Rusbridger's children's book. And then we'll send Piers. And he said, well, they won't buy that. I said, trust me, they won't even look at it. They are in the job of getting publicity for this probably something that Alan Rushridge probably thinks is quite inconsequential. He'll devote a day or half a day and he'll be in a hotel room somewhere and they'll just have a succession of people coming in asking about this book. And of course it happened. And Piers turned up at some, can't remember where it was. It may have been the Groucho Club or a small hotel in the West End. And Piers turns up. I would have paid anything. I should have had a photographer there to capture Alan Rushridge's expression when Piers walked in. And Piers sat down, turned on his tape recorder and started asking him very embarrassing questions. Now, I said at the time to Piers, when Piers called me up afterwards and told me what he'd managed to glean from Alan Rushridge, a lot of which was about his salary at the time, I said, if I'd have been Alan Rushridge, I would have immediately stood up and walked out. And if I had perhaps not done that, and I thought, okay, I'm going to give this a go, and I sat there for 5 or 10 minutes so I could see the way that the direction of travel, so to speak, I would have done exactly the same thing. But it did become quite a macho thing with Piers. It was gladiatorial. Yes. And it was the same with Boris Johnson and Ed Miliband and all of the number of people that Piers interviewed. It did become a battle. Which is why I say I don't think he was he obviously disagrees with me because he would, but I never thought he was fantastic with women because of that kind of the aggressive component, which was very important. But and then Alastair was the same. When Piers went off to be a TV star in America, I needed to replace him because I wanted someone to do those big interviews. And I'd seen Alastair Campbell eviscerate the deputy editor of the Daily Mail on Newsnight. And I thought, God, I hadn't realised that, I'd known Alastair light touch for a while, but he kind of spoke in perfect paragraphs. He was extraordinary. I thought, that's our man. And so I went to meet him and he said, he didn't want to go to a posh West End restaurant. He said, you come up to where the real people live. So we went up to Gospel Oak, posh Gospel Oak, and we had our chat. And Alastair was the same. He was slightly different, slightly more nuanced in some respects, slightly less tabloid in others, but he was very, very good. So to get back to your original question, I just thought it was very important to have politics as a component of something, that kind of world. I mean, our first success was William Hague. And actually, I asked my boss at the time to do the interview, Nicholas Coleridge. People say many things about Nicholas, but they often forget that he, at heart, was a journalist. He started as a journalist. He started on The Standard, I think, was his first job.
His first job, sort of, was at Harper's and Queen.
Of course it was. That's right. That's right. You are right.
As a teenager, the teenage issue.
Yeah. He was at Harper's and Queen and then went to The Standard. That's right. And so I asked him if he'd go off and interview William Hague, thinking in my naivety that it might be a kind of quite a nice romp. And he came back and he said, he told me this most extraordinary thing. And it caused a massive, I'm not sure you can say furore. I think Nicky Haslam thinks it's common. But it caused a big fuss at the time. And because Nicholas was asking him about what he'd done when he was a boy, before he entered politics. And William Hague said that he used to work for a brewery and he used to deliver barrels of beer to pubs. And he said that in every delivery, they'd sit and have a pint of beer. And Nicholas quite rightly said, well, how many deliveries a day would you make? So, and he said about 12. And so Nicholas said, are you telling me that you drank 12 pints of beer a day? And William Hague said, of course we did. And I think it's one of those things where you kind of say something and you immediately realise that it's not true. But it's impossible to contradict yourself.
Yes. Double down.
And you double down, exactly. And we got so much publicity in the days when you really could get publicity and publicity really meant a big deal. And that made me realise that we needed to do a lot more of that. So we did.
One day, maybe I've done it already, I'll tell you the story that, for me, definitive thing on Piers Morgan. A very, very funny dinner party where Piers Morgan was very, very funny quite inadvertently.
That's not the first time someone has told me something like that. I hope you do tell me this story.
Maybe I did.
It's obviously libelous, which is why you can't tell me now.
It's not totally libelous, but it was just absurd and wonderful, and everyone who was there remembers it forever because he was, in effect, doubling down. And it was a Bateman moment because everybody stopped their own conversations, didn't even pretend that they weren't.
Yeah. The man who ordered fish on a Friday or something, yeah.
Yeah.
Or a Monday.
They didn't even pretend that not to be an audience. And this to and fro between Piers Morgan and a very feisty, I think probably Nicky Haslam would think feisty was rather a common word, very feisty interlocutor, a girl,
right,
was hilarious, and it ended completely, revealingly hilarious. And
I can't wait to hear this story.
And every so often, under your auspices usually, I would meet, before Piers became an American television star, I would meet him probably in your auspices, and I would say something absurd to him, and he would greet it as a received truth. Do you know, he said, I would say, I loved your whatever, and he would say, oh yes. Oh yes. And I does think he does do some completely absurd things, but then they egg him on, don't they? And if you've got a 50 million, as I understand it, and as I understand he's done it and earned it, you've got a 50 million package from Rupert Murdoch there, you will do all that stuff, won't you? But I think it's fear eats the soul. So now, all those huge changes mean that everything that we might have assumed over the last 40 years is being challenged. In America, and to some extent in the UK, by people who would describe themselves as culturally conservative. And the nature of the challenge is such that, for instance, which of the great networks, the guy who produces 60 Minutes has resigned because there is so much pressure on him to conform to the government, and it comes directly and then obliquely through Paramount, which is the ultimate owner of the network which delivers 60 Minutes. That's a sort of, is that book burning? Is that book banning? Is it free speech? Is it censorship? What is that stuff?
I don't think we're in a good place with all of that. But I don't think you're going to find many people who think otherwise. It's incredibly worrying. I mean, just reeling back a bit, talking about culture, I do think that, I like to think that this anger and this polarization will feed into more traditional types of culture, because I think if you look at the kind of streams of culture, literature, art, pop music, drama, etc., I think you can look at pop and you can look at film to a certain extent, and I think you can look at art. I think a lot of those people, a lot of the big players in those worlds have, as you say, removed themselves. And what was that great Edwyn Collins line from A Girl Like You? Too many protest singers, not enough protest songs. That is a part of a culture which is dying out, because a lot of music these days has become very anodyne, and the channels have become very particular. And I think there's a real thirst for that. I think that there are many, many reasons, economic and structural, logistical reasons, why there isn't a kind of grassroots movement of young people making music in our big cities anymore. But I think that there is such an opportunity and a thirst now for culture being delivered in a more traditional way. So instead of going on a march, and going on a march might be more important, but maybe making a piece of music that espouses the same ideas that reaches billions of people through social media, is even more important than that. And I do think that's changed a lot, actually. And I think that if you look at cultural criticism and the way that cultural criticism has become more channeled, and you have a lot of critics now still, thankfully, in newspapers and online forever, but in the way that you don't really have that kind of teenage critical mass that you used to when magazines were important, for instance.
Yes.
All of that's gone. And we know that things are more difficult to stumble upon. And when you do, you can really stumble and do a deep dive into various dark places. But I do think that's a part of the culture which has disappeared. And we're not any the better for it, actually, because those discussions they feel like they're happening behind closed doors, because you only access them when you want to. I mean, I was doing something about a particular politician for the Standard a couple of months ago, and I decided to go down some of these rabbit holes and subscribe to various things and going onto social media and looking at particular things on my phone. And I mean, a lot of the stuff I found was appalling and hideous, and a lot of it completely untrue. And I think it's important to say this, because people say it and they kind of shrug it off as though, well, we know all that. But you start going down one particular road and the algorithm determines that this is what you want forever, and you are bombarded by it. And that was a horrific 6 weeks. It was absolutely extraordinary. And of course, journalistically, I found it quite compelling. But I can imagine that if you're not a journalist and you're slightly less robust, that these are very, very dark and dangerous places you go.
And the question I'm always asking is, how did those platforms, those sites, those troll factories come into being? Who made them happen? What are the tendencies behind that? Who financed them? Who put them up to it? Who are these people? Because there's a great deal of anonymity and cloaking associated with that world of hyper trolls.
That is certainly true. And I think that a lot of people who perhaps think of themselves as personalities are probably quite attracted by that kind of backing. But there's also a lot of solitary nut jobs out there.
Well, there is the fascinating case, which I have to say I explore in my latest book, Dead Cat on the Table, A Guide to Culture Wars.
You got a plug for your own book. This is outrageous. It's your podcast.
And I look at the fascinating case and the fascinating development of Russell Brand, who is now a born-again, dashed in the bath Christian, a born-again Christian of extreme right-wing views. 10 years ago, when I think it's literally 10 years ago, he was the special favourite of Owen Jones.
Correct.
That's an extraordinary thing, isn't it?
Slightly before that, I actually physically threw him out of our awards ceremony. He was on stage. I think he'd collecting some award for, Comedian of the Year or Agitator of the Year or something or other. And he got on stage and he started tearing into our sponsor, Hugo Boss, because he said that there is a line that can be drawn that suggests that Hugo Boss was responsible for making uniforms for the Third Reich. This caused a big to-do. And I have to say that there were tabloid instances which I very much manufactured and I wanted, and I knew that you put oil and water over together here and it's going to make a big fuss. That wasn't one of them. And I went up to him afterwards, before I led him to the door, and said, this is a pact. We're doing something for you. You do something for us. In what part of our agreement is it a good idea to slag off our sponsor? But already he'd begun to irritate the mass media so that we actually came out of that very well. He didn't. And I wouldn't say that we started. It wasn't the kind of start of the process, or that it had already begun. But he was a divisive figure when he became, when he was birthed by the media. I never liked him. And there's been an extraordinary churn of strange events in his life. But yeah, he's obviously turned into an even nastier person than I thought he was.
Yes, I think that's probably it. But it makes an entertaining chapter, and it does show how malleable people are and how self-interested, and how somebody who was hailed as a revolutionary and had a book by that name and all that stuff completely turned his opinions around. Completely turned his opinions around. Some people said, I've no way of knowing, but some people said, well, he wants to get the cover of Americans and the American right and large protesting American populations because he knows that there are some rather unpleasant court actions up ahead. As a new sort of person, he might get a bit more defenders.
I think that's a very plausible interpretation of his current journey. I couldn't possibly comment, of course, but I think it's very, very plausible. You have to step back a bit and just think that a lot of times with people like this, they just like being in the public eye.
Yes.
It's the Trumpian idea of what do I have to do now in order to get a headline? I know I'm going to say this. And it might not be more complicated than that, although I do think that your idea is very interesting.
Now, like me, but even more so, you've spent a lot of time in America. You worked for American companies. And when you were a wee boy, you were very, very attracted to American everything. And you had, because you were on Air Force bases and you were amongst Americans, you got an early double dose of American culture from 50s to 60s and onwards, because your parents loved all that stuff. How do you feel about America now?
Very conflicted, obviously, because it's going through a tumultuous period. Journalistically, I find it absolutely fascinating. I think that every day is another adventure. And I think that one of the joys, obviously, of working on a newspaper is having the ability to kind of play everything forward. But I think that that's become a fool's game at the moment. I think that everything that one anticipates doesn't happen because something else slightly madder happens. Yeah, we live in very, very strange, conflicted, nervous times. And I think culturally, I don't think culturally America is any less interesting. I think it's slightly more worrying in many respects, though.
I can remember the first time I went to America, and I don't really mean America, I mean New York. And I went with some nicer introductions, and for Dutch courage, one of my best friends from school. And after a while, we never paid for anything. Lovely Americans paid for everything. And I thought, I'd better come back here and make a habit of it. That didn't last forever. And that early introduction set up a feeling about New York and about California, because I never really went anywhere else. As a constant in the world, and a constant that would work well for us little British people who had to duck and dive, weave, and because we hadn't got anything else, little British people. And I don't have that confident feeling anymore, in the same way that I don't have that confident feeling about America and NATO, America and Russia, or any of that.
Well, I think we're talking. I think you're talking about very different things there. But I think that you obviously experienced the thing that lots of people did. We did too. When having a British accent and wearing funny clothes really played well in New York. I'm not sure absolutely. It does anymore.
No.
However, I was talking to someone else. I did a travel thing the other day, and I was saying that, I mean, New York remains a kind of viscerally exciting place to be. It has a lot of energy. It still hasn't recovered, I don't think, in terms of energy from 9/11. But I remember going there the first time when I was 23, and amongst all the kind of the assault on the kind of sensory assault, which is, it's unimaginable, because when you actually see it, it's more intense than you think it's going to be. I thought it was very parochial, and I still do. I've always thought New York is a very parochial place because it's so driven by status that it creates this extraordinary insecurity. And I remember, and in fact, I was talking about this the other day because my next book project is about restaurants. And I remember someone saying, have you been to so-and-so yet? And it's like some new restaurant. I said, no. I said, you have to go and you have to sit at table 42. And I'm thinking, no, I don't. I really don't. I don't care. My idea of a perfect kind of new restaurant experience is somewhere that opens with great fanfare. Everyone has an absolute paddy about it and thinks it's the most extraordinary thing in the world. I don't go. 18 months later, it closes, and the kind of world is perfect again. But I did find that there was something about New York that was just a little bit too try-hard, and I've always felt that. I've always loved going there. Having said that, I last went about a year ago, and I thought it was dirty, very expensive, and literally everywhere smelt of dope. And I'm not remotely prudish, but when you're in a cafe at 8:30 in the morning, and
you don't want that.
From the streets, you've got all this ganja pumping in. It's strange. No, but America is a very conflicted place at the moment. But I do think that that Keir Starmer is handling the American administration quite well this week.
Yes. It's a tough set of decisions for all of them. I think he's done very well so far, but my God, it's tough, and my God, it could break down so easily, because all those people have thought very different thoughts about Trump and all the extraordinary gang he's got round him very recently. It's an extraordinary pressure. The discipline you must maintain to get that right. And I fervently pray that they do get it right, that they do get a thing.
I think he's handled himself extraordinarily well. And I think that people who don't like Keir Starmer, they all admire that there's a kind of steely nature to him.
Yes.
There is a very strong kernel in there somewhere. And I think you need that to be a leader. You need that to be a leader of a political party. And he's very, very strong. And I think people like that. And he often comes across in completely the other way. And I don't want to start talking about the economy, but I think Labour's honeymoon period happened before they got elected. And I think that it just didn't happen. And it's been a problem because when you campaign on growth strategically and then tactically, everything that you deliver or announce after you get elected is anti-growth is an issue. But I think internationally, on this particular subject, he's pretty much been exemplary. But that's this week. It could all change next week.
Thinking about that extraordinary parochialism but excitingness of New York, and I didn't notice the parochialism till my second visit because I was too excited by the excitingness. I was talking to Graydon Carter, just like I am to you now. I was talking to Graydon Carter a couple of weeks back.
Very good book.
Very good book. And I was talking about his feud with Donald Trump over the decades. And it lasted from the time that he wrote a piece in American GQ in the 80s that said Trump had small hands.
The small-fingered vulgarian.
The small-fingered vulgarian. That was it. Now, at some point, Donald Trump must have realized that in Manhattan, try as he might, people didn't think very much of him. And Graydon Carter had some wonderful term that he was a sort of novelty celebrity sometimes. And he was a novelty guest for his naffness. He was there for his naffness and rather odd notoriety rather than celebrity. And then Graydon said, I never saw him in anybody's sitting rooms. You know, so You might just think, mightn't you, that one of the motives in what Trump is doing would be very personal, because he is very personal, that he is what English people call chippy. about what happened to him in New York.
I think that I think Graydon did a very good job of picking that particular wound, and he's been very funny about it, I have to say. But it's a very good book. It's a very good book.
So he is, I think, let's look at it from the stylist in you. There is a great strand of vulgarity in everything that Donald Trump does. You know, just visual stylists forget who he is and what he's been doing, but you just think of those sort of bodyguard suits and the red ties and the decoration of the Trump Tower apartment. I wrote a piece on it for Politicos in Washington, so I got lots and lots of pictures of it, and it's even worse than you might think. And it's very, very fascinating. That is a thing. Now, defiant vulgarity is a theme of being Donald Trump. But there was a time when he must have felt, like the Obama White House Correspondents' Dinner, that he was being made fun of.
Yeah, but I think that this is, and I don't think that the notion of Donald Trump being vulgar is, I think one of the reasons there are a lot of people in America who look at Trump and they think that he's the lesser of two evils. I think that part of that appeal is the fact that he is mocked by smart people.
Yes.
He's called a vulgarian.
Yes.
And I think that I'm certainly not saying it's an excuse, but I think that it feels like it feels like old buns to me. I think the conversation's moved on. I think Graydon's relationship with Trump has been interesting, because I remember being in Atlantic City in 1988, I think it was.
Ooh.
And I can't remember the exact date. Trump was between women, and all the gossip in all the places I went to at Atlantic City that weekend were about the fact that he was there a Marla Marples? Is that a person?
That's the person. That is the person. After Ivana.
I think You're right, yeah. One of the interesting things, I think that's why that movie was so interesting, was because it was about the formative years. It was the years of indecision, the years of the kind of tentative years, as we were talked about earlier. That time where the idea of him was bigger than him himself, and his idea of his own self-image was much bigger. I mean, Tina writes a lot about Trump in her book too, because obviously they had closer proximity. The only time that we had any direct dealings with Trump, and he did call the office a few times, was when we photographed Mrs. Trump, although she wasn't Mrs. Trump at the time. We photographed her in Trump's private jet. And we used, I think, the photographer, I can't remember who the photographer was. It was quite a ribald photographer in the days when we had slightly more flesh in the magazine and the culture was rather different. And our instructions to the stylist were to make her look like an evil Bond girl, scantily clad with lots of hardware. I mean, they're actually ridiculous photographs. They were ridiculous then, and they're ridiculous now. But we had a lot of fun with them at the time. And then when Trump was running for election the first time, in fact, it was the guy I talked about earlier who had been the irritating intern. He said, "Didn't you publish some pictures of her?" And we go, "Did we? God, we did." And then we put them up. We recontextualized the whole thing. We wrote a very kind of arch introduction, and these pictures went online and obviously broke the internet. And we had, I think we pumped them out every kind of 6 weeks, and it was extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. It was a goldmine. We didn't realize we had all this stuff. But I do remember at the time, I think I'm right, that he called up because I think, he was very keen to see the pictures and then wanted to offer his congratulations, quite zealous congratulations after these things were printed, which was over 25 years ago now, I think. By the way, you haven't asked me the most pertinent question, which is the only reason I'm here.
Suede shoes?
Yeah.
Yes. We're getting right onto that.
It's not Jermyn Street.
That's a very good response, because Jermyn Street is just a figure of speech for a nice, smart, expensive place.
It's Royal Arcade.
Royal Arcade.
And it's George Cleverly.
They make, to my certain knowledge, a very beautiful brogue.
They also make shoes for me, and they make a very beautiful chisel toe slip-on shoe, which I think many of my friends think is an evening shoe, but it's not, because it's not patent.
Yes.
But there we are.
But you are also an adherent of the classic Gucci loafer, aren't you?
I am. In fact, I'm wearing them at the moment.
Very, very wise. Very, very wise. So you were obsessive about clothes, and you describe in your very marvellous book, These Foolish Things, you describe extensively the extraordinary wardrobes that you put together.
The colour coordination, Peter.
I see the colour. It's brilliant colour coordination. I wish I'd thought of that. And you describe the outfits you had on at particular points in time. And you've got, like Compton Mackenzie, you've got total recall. I haven't got that total recall. And you describe marvellously, I don't think I've invented this, not in the book, but in something you did on YouTube, you described marvellously how you'd had a lovely wardrobe, a tiny room, a difficult relationship with the girl you were then living with, who then destroyed all your lovely clothes.
Oh, God, yes. We were in the process of splitting up.
Yeah.
She still had a key, and I came home one night, and I can remember the exact date, because it was Alan Yentob had produced a programme with Anthony Wall and Nigel Finch for Arena, and it was called, in fact, you were in it, it was called Ligmalion.
I was in it.
Yeah.
Ligmalion.
And I was round at a friend's house watching that, because we were in it too. And I got home, and my ex-girlfriend was in my very tiny bedroom, and she had been there for quite some time with a pair of scissors, and she had cut up pretty much everything that I own. Beautiful, beautiful suits from Scott Crowler, John Galliano, Stephen Linnard, Catherine Hamnett, World's End, lots of Vivienne Westwood. But the worst thing she did, she cut up my Baswegians. I had these beautiful tan Baswegians. And that was certainly a significant end to our relationship, although there was a denouement to this, where we arranged to meet and where she could give me her keys back. And she used to work for the BBC. And we met in the underpass under Shepherd's Bush Roundabout. And it was a bit like a kind of bad comic strip remake of the OK Corral, where she came in from one side and I came in from the other. And I could see that she was holding a full bottle of Quink. Quink? You remember Quink? It's blue ink. Fountain.
Ink. Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, no brand names. Yeah. Other blue inks do exist. Yeah. So that was the real denouement. I can't remember if I got the keys, but I didn't get too close, but I didn't want to be covered in blue ink.
Blimey, what a life you've had. And how very brilliant is your book, and how very marvellous is your YouTube presence. Very important, that. So, the answer is, it's Royal Arcade, and it's George Cleverly. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter.
For joining my little podcast. Once again, huge thanks to Dylan Jones. Now, in the next episode of my podcast, I'll be talking to the journalist, author and broadcaster Yasmin Alabai-Brown. Peter York's Culture Wars House Party is presented by me, Peter York, and it's produced by Kate Dixon at Good Egg Productions. Do join me again. Goodbye.